Alright, now let's dive into a topic that can be pretty confusing, understanding the cross-sectional layout of the brainstem. We've already said that the brainstem acts like a data highway between the brain and the spinal cord, but it's not just a conduit for information, it also houses important cell body nuclei too. To make sense of it, we need to examine how its structure changes as we move from the spinal cord inferiorly up to the cortex superiorly. But looking at the brainstem from the outside won't tell us the full story, so let's add some cross sections and okay, much better. This will give us a clearer picture of what's happening inside. So to get oriented, let's start just below the brainstem with the C1 spinal cord. Here's a quick reminder. Over here, we have our anterior or ventral side, and over here is our posterior or dorsal side. On the dorsal side, you'll find the dorsal horn, which receives sensory input from neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. This is also where major sensory tracts enter the spinal cord, which you'll remember are the spinothalamic tract, which is responsible for pain and temperature sensation, and the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract, which carries fine touch, vibration, and proprioception information. The spinothalamic tract comes in via the dorsal horn, usually travels up 2 levels or so ipsilaterally, creating a small structure called Lissauer's tract, before crossing over at the anterior commissure. However, because we're looking at C1 and there isn't really another level to go up to, the C1 spinothalamic tract pretty much just crosses over at the same level. Next, let's point out the dorsal funiculus, which is just a fancy way of saying dorsal group of axon fibers. There, we can spot 2 key components of our dorsal columns: the fasciculus gracilis, which carries sensory input from the lower body, and the fasciculus cuneatus, carrying sensory input from the upper body. I like to keep these straight in my mind by remembering that if I'm standing upright, my legs are in between my arms, and they also start lower down than my arms do. Now, let's move over to our ventral side, where we can see our prominent ventral horn home to the lower motor neurons. These lower motor neurons relay motor commands from the corticospinal tracts, both the lateral and anterior ones, to your muscles, allowing for voluntary movement. The lateral corticospinal tract in particular is our major pathway for voluntary control of our limbs. Lastly, we can also see here the nucleus for our spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, and that plays an important role in innervating our sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Now, because this is the first cranial nerve nucleus that we've seen, I'm going to go into something that I didn't realize until embarrassingly late in my own learning about all of this. Our cranial nerves don't just magically pop out of the brain. Each one, like cranial nerve 11, has its own nucleus where the action starts. Remember that voluntary control of our skeletal muscles originates with instructions from our primary motor cortex, and those upper motor neurons synapse with the lower motor neurons within these nuclei. What we call cranial nerves are in part just the lower motor neuron fibers actually projecting out of the brain, heading out to do their job. I also want to pause here and clarify our notation a bit. As you can see, our spinothalamic tract is pictured in red, and the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract is pictured in blue, and the corticospinal tract is pictured in green. These will remain consistent throughout the video to make things easier to follow. Alright, now we're going to move a bit more superiorly and examine a transitional region of the spinal cord called the cervicomedullary junction, the point where the cervical spinal cord transitions into the lower medulla. Additionally, for each new section we discuss, I'll keep the previous layer below so you can compare them side by side. Let's begin by pointing out our main tracts. Right off the bat, we can see our corticospinal tract again, but now there's a twist. Literally. See what I did there? It turns out that this is actually the level where the pyramidal decussation happens, or the part of the spinal cord where our motor fibers cross over to the opposite side. So if your right motor cortex wants to move your left hand, this is where the signal switches sides at the inferior medulla. Next, we can see our fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus hanging out on the dorsal side. Same as before, we can also see our spinothalamic tract sitting on the lateral edges. Let's take a second to also acknowledge that by this point, that is, upon entering the brainstem, both our spinothalamic and corticospinal tracts have already crossed. Alright, moving up again, now we land in the middle medulla. Again, we'll be going over our major tracts first. One of the biggest changes here is what's happening on the dorsal side. This is where the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus finally terminate as the gracillae and cuneate nuclei. Here's why that matters. Those dorsal column fibers we've been tracking have been traveling ipsilaterally, that is, on the same side, the whole time. But once they hit these nuclei, they finally decussate and cross over, meaning that all 3 of our tracts have crossed over now by the time we hit the medulla. Let's also point out our spinothalamic tracts here, and also our corticospinal tracts, which are now traveling up our pyramids. Okay, now we're going to go into some unique features that are found in the medulla, and I'll draw them out one by one so we don't overwhelm you. On the ventral side, you can't miss this beautiful swirly structure, which is the inferior olivary nucleus. While it looks fancy, it has a super practical job. It's part of the cerebellar system and sends out climbing fibers that talk to the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. Basically, it helps your brain compare what you planned to do with what you actually did. And if there's a major, and I emphasize major mismatch, it helps you correct it. I can nerd out on the cerebellum all day, but I'll save that for another video. While we're here, check out the inferior cerebellar peduncles hanging out on the sides. These are like highways connecting the medulla to the cerebellum, shuttling information back and forth to help you stay coordinated. Again, I'll make a separate video explaining this, so I won't belabor the point here. Just medial to that and adjacent to the fourth ventricle, we find our area postrema, which is part of our brain's vomiting center. What makes it special is that it has a particularly weak blood-brain barrier on purpose. Why is that? Well, because it needs to sample what's in our blood and CSF for toxins. If it senses something dangerous, then we're going to re-experience those fun nights hunched over a toilet. It's one of those quirky but life-saving adaptations. Another key player of our medulla found here is the nucleus tractus solitarius. This nucleus handles a ton of autonomic sensory input from cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10, and is involved in regulating things like cardiovascular function, respiratory control, and gastrointestinal responses, and even taste perception by a thalamic relay to the cortex. Just a bit anteriorly to our nucleus tractus solitarius is our nucleus ambiguus, which controls the muscles for swallowing and speech, which are branchial pharyngeal motor muscles, and also parasympathetic heart rate regulation. It tends to be associated with cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11, which makes sense given its function. I know there's a lot here, but we only have 2 more things to cover in the medulla. First, check out the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This structure is all about coordinating our eye movements. It connects cranial nerves 3, the oculomotor nerve, 4, the trochlear nerve, and 6, the abducens nerve, making sure that our eyes move together in a smooth, synchronized way. Damage here is classic for giving you internuclear ophthalmoplegia, where your eyes can't track together smoothly. Finally, and this is super important, you'll get the hypoglossal nucleus hanging out here. This is the second cranial nerve nucleus we've encountered, and it's the home base for cranial nerve 12, which controls tongue movements. Alright, so now we're going to move up from the medulla and we land in the pons, which is our next major step along the brainstem highway. Broadly speaking, the pons is divided into 2 main areas. In the back, near the fourth ventricle, we've got the pontine tegmentum, which has our middle cerebellar peduncles on the sides. And up front, there's the basis pontis, also called the pons proper if you're feeling fancy, or the belly of the pons if you're not. Now, if we stick with the same landmarks we've been following, you'll spot the medial lemniscus carrying fine touch and proprioception information, and the spinothalamic tract handling pain and temperature. And right there in the basis pontis, well, that's where the corticospinal tract continues as it descends towards the spinal cord. But here's where things start to get a little spicy. The pons is also home to the nuclei for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. Let's break those down. Starting with cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nucleus hangs out on the posterolateral tegmentum. Its motor fibers, which control your muscles of mastication, sit more medially. The sensory portion, responsible for facial sensation, sits laterally. Nearby are the nuclei for cranial nerves 6 and 7, and this is where things get a little weird anatomically. The abducens nucleus, that is, for cranial nerve 6, is responsible for controlling the lateral rectus muscle, which moves your eyes outward. However, the fibers from the facial nerve nucleus, cranial nerve 7, actually loop around the abducens nucleus before exiting the pons. It's like the facial nerve is taking a scenic route before it heads out to control the muscles of the facial expressions. Another thing about the abducens nucleus is it's not just a lateral rectus command center, it's also a horizontal gaze center. That means that it coordinates both eyes to move horizontally towards the same side as the nucleus. So if you want to glance left, the left abducens nucleus is calling the shots. Now, cranial nerve 8, our vestibulocochlear nerve, is a bit more complicated. We won't picture it here in our model necessarily, but what you should be aware of for it is that it serves 2 functions, which both have their own unique nuclei. The cochlear nuclei, which is responsible for hearing, is located in the pons medulla junction more laterally, whilst the vestibular nuclei, which is important for balance, is found more medially. Again, I'll probably talk about this one in a separate video. All in all, when you look at the pons from the outside, you'll see that these cranial nerves emerging on the ventral surface, but just remember their nuclei are tucked away on the inside. And don't forget about that little facial nerve detour. Alright, now we've finally moved up to the midbrain, the topmost chunk of the brainstem. One of the first things you'll notice is this little hole running through the middle. That's a cerebral aqueduct, a narrow channel connecting the third and fourth ventricles. Surrounding it is a periaqueductal gray, which is a huge player in pain modulation. This area is like the brain's built-in painkiller system, and it helps suppress pain signals when you're in distress. Swinging over to the front, we meet the cerebral peduncles, these massive fiber bundles that look like two big columns. Think of them as express highways carrying motor commands from the cerebral cortex down to the brainstem and the spinal cord. Inside these peduncles, you'll find our corticospinal tract, hello little guy, along with other tracts handling motor signals for cranial nerves and more. In the middle, you'll still spot those descending sensory pathways we've been tracking, both the spinothalamic for pain and temperature and the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway for fine touch and proprioception. And by this point, all these pathways have already crossed over, so everything here is again relaying contralateral sensory information. Again, the midbrain is home to nuclei for cranial nerves 3 and 4. Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, handles most of the muscles that move your eye, plus the ones that lift your eyelid and constrict your pupil. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, is a little special. It's the only cranial nerve that exits dorsally, that is from the back of the brainstem, and controls the superior oblique muscles, which helps with downward and inward eye movement. Now, to conclude our tour of the midbrain, we need to talk about the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. The substantia nigra is known for its role in motor control. Specifically, it's a key part of the basal ganglia circuit. It helps initiate and smooth out voluntary movements, and damage here is a hallmark of Parkinson's disease, where you get tremors and difficulty initiating movement because of dopamine loss. Right next door is the red nucleus, which has its own cool gig. It's involved in the rubrospinal tract, which helps with flexor muscle tone, basically fine-tuning some of the upper limb movements. It's not as important in humans as it is in other animals. So, to sum up, the midbrain is a powerhouse for motor control and sensory relay. You've got pain modulation in the periaqueductal gray, motor highways in the cerebral peduncles, and key motor nuclei like the substantia nigra and red nucleus. Plus, it's where eye movement control kicks into gear with cranial nerves 3 and 4. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the slides that we had gone through in the animation right next to actual slides. So these are pictures of stained spinal cord sections, and it'll correlate basically what you saw in the animation with the image labeled itself. So please enjoy, and if you have any comments, questions, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below.